Okay, Nancy, you're up, and I've just started the recording as well.
Thank you so much, Stan. Thanks so much, Nate, as well. All right. Well, everybody, it's great to see you this morning, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about the Canadian market, give a little bit of a refresher there, and then talk a little bit about the relationship between Ohio and Canada, and then really dig into the new agreement, the new USMCA, or CUSMA, as we call it here in Canada, and what kind of opportunities this may provide for Ohio companies looking at the Canadian market. So let's get started. All right, so first, just a brief overview of the Canadian market. Obviously, your neighbor to the north, but it's an interesting country in the sense that it's similar in many ways to the United States with respect to business practices and culture and whatnot, but also quite different as well. And really, you know, we're the second largest country in the world with a population of just under 38 million people, so a very large space and not a large population. And about 85% of that population lives fairly close to the US-Canadian border. And really, when we look at Canada, we don't really look at it as one country that's the same. We really look at it as 5 or 6 regional markets. So Ontario and Quebec, they make up about 60% of the economy as well as the population in Canada, but are also very unique. Quebec, in some ways, doing business there is more like doing business in Europe, even from a legal standpoint. Ontario, very strong ties, obviously, to the Great Lakes region and Ohio. Then we look at Western Canada, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, very strong resources economies, as well as manufacturing, especially in Manitoba. And then British Columbia. I mean, British Columbia and Alberta side by side, but you couldn't have 2 provinces that are more unique from each other. One very much focused on extractive industry and food production, Alberta, whereas British Columbia does have a strong extractive industry, forest industry as well. It is very much focused on clean technology development and positioning themselves as a clean tech and ITC jurisdiction. So as I say, in really looking at this, at the size and scope of the market, it's important, I think, for US and Ohio exporters to realize that moving products across the country can be a little bit more challenging from a logistics standpoint. You know, we've got one highway as opposed to a very integrated interstate system that you have in the United States, as well as rail systems. So as I say, this is a consideration certainly for selling product into the country to keep in mind. And then looking at how companies do business in Canada. Ohio companies typically start off looking for partners here, working with distributors, representatives, that type of thing, and then maybe move on to selling direct to customers using the non-resident importer program, which is really positions companies or US companies to seem like or look and feel like a Canadian company. Moving forward, some companies do opt to set up branch offices or partnerships, joint ventures, that kind of thing. And the other aspect of that, partnerships, is to say acquisitions or investments. I think in the post-COVID environment, we're going to see more of those kinds of opportunities moving forward. As an example, Saputo, a large Quebec agriculture or dairy company, has put it out there that they're very interested in acquisition in a post-COVID environment, and certainly looking at the US for that. The other opportunity for US and Ohio companies is government procurement, especially at the federal level, where there are opportunities for companies to bid on projects, register as suppliers. Some do so directly, and some may look to finding Canadian partners to work jointly on those kinds of bids. So those are some of the strategies, or I would say the market channel opportunities that Ohio companies typically take when looking at the Canadian market. Okay. So then to look at some of Canada's key industries, I mean, in many ways, Canada and the United States have fairly similar economies in the sense that they're quite diverse. I mean, Canada, about 70% of our GDP comes from services. And this is everything from financial services, medical services, you name it. But we do also have very strong extractive industries with respect to things like mining, oil and gas, as I referenced earlier with Alberta, although this is a segment that's seen significant downturn, even post-COVID, just with pipeline issues, which I'm sure many of you have heard in the news about. But what we've also seen here in Canada is a shift towards renewable energy. We get currently about 60% of our energy from hydro, mostly from Quebec, Ontario, and BC. So this is a move, and also government policy has been put in place with respect to climate change and looking at growing this segment even further. Machinery and equipment, strong automotive as well as aerospace segments, and many different equipment around these segments as well. And then on the services side, financial services is probably the largest growing or fastest growing services export in the Canadian market. If anyone's visited a TD Bank in the US, that's actually Toronto Dominion, and they now have more retail locations in the United States than they do in Canada. Scotiabank, one of our other large 5-6 banks, has a very strong presence in Latin America, and actually Mexico. They're one of the largest banks now in Mexico. The other area that's quite large in the Canadian economy is software and ICT, internet technology. All of the big players have offices and development centers here, utilizing some of the great skill sets that are available in the market. Companies like BlackBerry, I'm sure some of you recall having a BlackBerry phone at one time. BlackBerry doesn't really make phones, well, not really anymore, but they are very much involved in the autonomous vehicle space, offering their encrypted platform for autonomous and connected vehicles. So they're still a very strong company. It's just not one that you hear as much about. And Shopify, I'll chat about them a little bit later, because they're certainly a company that's seen much more growth in the last little while, especially with respect to COVID. So that gives a bit of a summary of some of the key industries in Canada. So now I want to talk a little bit about the Ohio-Canada relationship. Okay. So Ohio has significant exports to the Canadian market. Canada is Ohio's #1 export market. And what I want to do, this gives you kind of a general of what categories. Oops, sorry about that. I'm just going to go back here. This gives an overview, but I want to dig into a few of these categories specifically. So products, in the equipment and machinery space. These include things like gas turbines, reactors, boilers, mechanical appliances, electrical and electronic machinery. And then in the transportation area, we are talking about everything from trucks to truck components, ignitions, pistons, brakes, and then also aerospace, aircraft, and as well as helicopter parts. And then we look at chemicals and plastics and rubber. So these are everything from detergents, cleaning, organic chemicals. These are strong sectors. And plastics, many different types of resins, polyethylenes, polycarbonates, polypropylene, acrylics, these kinds of things, typically in primary form, but also in as well as finished plastics. So these are some of the key categories. And then, as I say, minerals and metals, and then agricultural products, which are things like cereals, flours, and my favorite, the miscellaneous edible preparations, which I'm not actually sure what that is, but a little dubious, but certainly a top category. Wonderful. Okay. And then if we look to what Ohio exports from a service standpoint to Canada, and again, services are a growing segment. So obviously services in the travel area, these will decline as a result of COVID and border closures. But previous to this has been a growing segment. Financial services, which I referenced earlier, business and professional and technical services, this is also a growing segment. And we work with a number of companies in that space that have been looking to bring technical staff across the border and whatnot, which is still possible under COVID. While there are border restrictions, it is still possible to have service technicians coming into emergency service and after sales service. So that is, as I say, still an opportunity. So now that we've talked, well, I'll just talk a little bit briefly about what what Canada exports to Ohio, and you'll see a similar sort of group of categories. I think with respect to categories that maybe you're not necessarily exporting, although specialty paper is an area that Ohio also does export to Canada, but forestry products, more base minerals, as well as petroleum and that kind of thing, energy and whatnot are big categories going the other way. But as I said, when you look at how much Ohio imports from Canada, 12 billion in goods, as opposed to what Ohio exports to Canada, just around 21 billion. It's a pretty significant trade surplus for the state. So now that we talked a little bit about the relationship and whatnot, I want to dig into the agreement. So when we look at the new USMCA, or CUSMA as we call it here in Canada, essentially USMCA replaces NAFTA and came into force last Wednesday, July 1st. What I think is interesting about the agreement is it really, I think, strives to be a living agreement in the sense that it'll be reviewed every 6 years, and the agreement does expire after 16 years. And as the Office of the United States Trade Representative noted, this is a mutually beneficial win-win for North America, farmers, ranchers, and businesses. So I think all three parties do feel that they came away with significant benefits for workers and whatnot. So I think it is, as I say, it was a challenging negotiation, but certainly bringing forward benefits to all three parties. Now you can see my circles here talking about some of the impacted, or what we sort of see as the most impacted areas. So everything from rules of origin, trade facilitation, digital trade, intellectual property, agriculture, labor, and as well as the certificate of origin. Now I'll dig into each one of these a little bit more so, but one I did want to note was the environmental focus, which really is providing specific provisions for trilateral environmental cooperation on specific issues like invasive flora species, marine plastic litter, which has become a big issue, and as well as illegal trade in forest products. So as I say, all of these areas are important, and we'll take a deeper dive into each of these moving forward. Okay, so there have been significant changes in the rules of origins, and they really affect, I would say, specifically sectors more so than others, which are automobiles and textiles. And I'll chat a little bit more about each of those in a moment. And so I think it's important, if you have not already done this, to be really looking at your rules of origin under the new agreement, working with your supply chain, understanding whether your products are still qualifying and whatnot, and whether your suppliers' products are qualifying with respect to components and whatnot. So this is an important exercise to be starting or moving forward with, working with your freight forwarder and that type of thing. So another area that the new agreement includes are these sectoral annexes. And essentially what these annexes are focused on is promoting enhanced regulatory compatibility. Obviously with three different countries, three different norms and rules and whatnot, it can be challenging in some sectors for companies bringing products into Canada with respect to different regulatory regimes. So a couple I wanted to touch on that I thought were kind of important in this. So chemical substances as an example. And chemical substances, there are new rules now in place, 8 new rules that provide qualifying criteria that may make many chemical products that were not eligible under NAFTA previously will now be qualifying under the USMCA. And this includes everything from the location of the chemical reaction, separation, the particle size, the mixture, biochemical process blends, etc. So again, if you're in the chemical space, this is something to review closely, because it could mean that products that you may have had that were not qualifying previously may now be. So this is a definite benefit. In the cosmetics and the medical device area, there's very much a focus on good manufacturing practices, as well as harmonizing labeling and regulatory alignment. So these are ongoing areas, but again, really are focused on working with working with manufacturers in these spaces to ensure that they can move product into the market without trade barriers around regulatory regimes. So these are ongoing types of practices that will be seen or will be reviewed with committees that are struck from all three countries. And as I say, will be ongoing. So these are important areas. Okay. All right. So then if we look with respect to the certificate of origin, one of the key changes from the USMCA from NAFTA is there no longer is an official certificate of origin. Now, the USMCA still requires a certification of origin, which means that companies need to be able to provide these 9 minimum data elements. And it doesn't matter how they're provided, whether it's on a PO or an invoice, as long as they are there. Now, some brokers and customs folks that I've heard speak recently have recommended that companies take these data points, put them on a letterhead, and have that at hand at all times, really essentially emulating a certificate. However, what they also recommend is not using your previous certificate of origin or thinking it's appropriate to pass, because they seem to feel that customs may have a challenge if they don't feel that you've done the review of your specific product category and ensure that it does in fact still meet the requirements for the tariff preference levels. So as I say, yeah, and more information on certification is on the USTR website if people are interested. Okay. Another area that is also has its own separate chapter in the new agreement is trade facilitation. And this is really targeted in some ways towards the SME, the small to medium-sized enterprise market. And really what it aims to do is to assist these exporters to move goods more easily and to remove barriers with respect to having different customs procedures and different customs windows. And there are a number of points on that I think are important. Really, what they're trying to provide is uniform treatment across ports and border crossings, ensuring that rules regarding value calculation or tariff application are uniformly honored across all ports and border crossings. And now too, electronic document submission will be equal to paper documentation. And obviously there is a push to be able to offer all documentation electronically, just to have a faster movement of products and goods. And additionally, the other thing that this trade facilitation chapter requires is that all government rules and processes are published online and updated frequently with changes and whatnot. So as I said, really the idea is to ensure that the movement of goods is as seamless as possible. And that also refers a bit to the de minimis area, which I reference here, and I'll chat about that a little bit later with respect to the e-commerce market. So, great. Okay. So with respect to opportunities, we feel here in Toronto or across Canada, these 9 segments really benefit from the new agreement. Automotive, obviously that's a big sector for Ohio. Agriculture, textiles, also good segments. Digital trade, intellectual property, finance, the small to medium-sized enterprise, infrastructure, which I'll chat about a little bit more in depth, kind of from a post-COVID standpoint. And a big segment, I think, which is really, really important, is the e-commerce area, both business to consumer, B2C, as well as business to business. So, all right, so these are just a few upgrades covering the auto and auto parts area with respect to regional content, increases use of steel and aluminum, which must originate in North America, although it looks like we may have another trade challenge coming up with respect to aluminum specifically, but we'll see where that goes. and then some other respective or other aspects which have been quite valuable, which is the labor value content. Now, my colleague Efren Flores from Ohio's Mexico office will be speaking on this in depth next week, next Wednesday. So I encourage you to participate in his presentation as well to learn a lot more. This is a very technical segment, and these rules apply differently depending on the auto or where in the vehicle you are, and also in additional light vehicles as opposed to trucks. So as I said, Efren's going to dig into that a lot more next week. So great. Now, another segment which really is an important one for Ohio and for U.S. exporters is the food and agricultural products area. So Canada has a market or a market supply program. So there are significant challenges to exporting dairy products into the market as well as poultry and eggs. But Canada's actually made significant concessions in this area, which I think started off really with the CPTPP and has now been moved into the USMCA. So there's an additional 3.6, and this actually starts pretty immediately. So within the first month of the agreement, significant changes will happen and market access has opened up. And this is for a number of different categories, including milk, butter, cream, yogurt. The other thing that the agreement does is it eliminates classes 6 and 7, which were quite controversial, and there were a lot of issues around the classification of these specific products also being sold as ingredients into the U.S. market. It also eliminates the restriction on ultra filtered milk, opening that up. And then, as you can see, her reclassification of skim milk product, milk protein, that kind of thing. It also gets rid of, over time, or phases out quota on margarine and whey, which is important because it's a big ingredient product. And I think that's the thing to think about with respect to food and ag, is that essentially agriculture products are kind of like cars in the sense that many inputs and ingredients move cross-border multiple times before they're put into a finished food product on your grocery shelf. So as I say, this does offer a lot of good opportunities moving forward. And 3.6 doesn't seem like a lot, but this actually increases year over year. And the same is for poultry, eggs, which is actually chicken, turkey, and eggs. So more access is allowed there and increases every year. Canada's wheat grading system, which has been also quite controversial, will end, and now all US grain in the market will have a Canadian grade, I guess. So essentially this is going to allow, or a lot of Canadian grain farmers are actually quite pleased about this, feel it allows not only for US competitiveness, but also kind of global competitiveness in the grain segment. The other thing that's important that has now been established is geographical indicators. So these are important in the sense that that they allow for really more transparency in determining what is a common name for a product and what is a specific geographic reference. So linking a product and its origins. So Kentucky bourbon, Parma ham, these are examples. And I think as we move more into brand consciousness, this is important because this really helps to protect brands for regional areas. Now, another area, now this isn't necessarily specifically mentioned in the new agreement, but that's the ethanol industry. So continues to have duty-free access for grapeseed oils. And there are going to be some new opportunities opening up in Canada because Ontario, our most populated province, plans to adopt a new E15 standard by 2025. So that's going to open up more opportunities for US seed oil exporters. The last thing I want to mention with respect to the agreement, it specifically mentions innovative technologies or biotech, things like gene editing, CRISPR kind of things. So these are actually specifically protected within the agreement. So that's an important aspect as well for anyone in the ag bio space. So as I say, there are a lot of good opportunities in the agricultural area for Ohio exporters moving or looking at growing presence in Canada. Oops. I went back instead of forward. Okay, so the other, as I mentioned with respect to auto, agriculture, and textiles is probably the third area that's seen some significant changes. Um, and really, much like the automotive sector, these changes in the textiles area really look to incentivize the use of North American inputs. So specific areas like sewing thread, pocket fabric, narrow elastic coated fabrics, these are all products that will see more growth or more access in the Canadian market. Tariff preferential levels, so these have been increased in the apparel area for both Canada and Mexico, so opening up opportunities there. The de minimis rule for products that are not easy to source in North America has risen from 7 to 10%, allowing products or finished components, or finished products, I should say, with those components a little bit more if they're not able to find them in North America. And lastly, I think also the opportunity to work collaboratively for enforcement to help prevent circumvention and fraud. There's actually a lot of counterfeiting in the textile and fashion area. We've seen a lot of cases in Montreal, which is a big fashion hub. So I think this is something that's also been really welcomed by the apparel industry in Canada as well as in North America as a whole. So. Okay, and then moving on to digital trade. So digital trade, I mean, obviously when NAFTA came into being in 1994, the internet barely existed. I mean, I remember using it in university, and it was our internal system, but you know, the internet as we know it today was really just a vision, I think, of maybe Jeff Bezos, I'm not sure, but so really the specific Chapter 19 for digital trade does a lot of things that help to enhance the distribution electronically. So there's no duties on products that are distributed electronically, and these include everything from ebooks to videos, music, software, as well as games. And this is, you know, personal, but also business to business. It also ensures that data can be moved more easily across borders. And I think it allows things like e-signing of documents, protection of business confidential information, and it also protects proprietary computer source code. So if someone is coming into the Canadian market from the US or Mexico, they are no longer, border service is no longer permitted to ask them to provide any proprietary computer source code on any business related items. So, and it also, the chapter also works forward in, you know, promoting collaboration with respect to cybersecurity, which is a significant thing. The other aspect of it, which is really interesting, and I'll touch on it in financial services, is it reduces or minimizes data localization rules. And this is, as I say, is quite important in the financial services industry, which I'll chat about just momentarily. And then tied in with digital trade is intellectual property improvements. And again, the agreement has moved forward in this area significantly. And I referenced it earlier also with respect to biotech. But really the intellectual property area looks, you can see here, extends the copyright terms in Canada. So essentially what we are now doing is matching the US term, which is the author plus 70 years. So the life of the author plus 7 years. Previously it was 50 years here under NAFTA and in Canada. Provides better trademark protection, 10-year period of protection, which it is in US law, and removes some administrative requirements to enable easier protection and enforcement of trademarks. Industrial designs, it really speaks to sort of ornamental or aesthetic aspects of a product, and USMCA provides a minimum of 15 years protection for industrial design compared to 10 years for NAFTA. The other aspect too of intellectual property is national treatment. So again, it requires that each of the three USMCA party countries treat companies and their intellectual property the same as they would a local company. So that's an important aspect too. And this again, I mean, the intellectual property, the digital trade, and the services of the financial services area all tie in very well together and kind of support each other. So as I mentioned, with respect to the prohibition on local data storage requirements, this is actually really important for the financial industry, because previously, if a US bank, a PNC or a Fifth Third or M&T had customers in Canada, they were required to keep that customer information on a Canadian server and actually own a Canadian server or lease a Canadian server. So that will no longer be the case, which is actually I think is quite a boon for the financial services industry as well as some others. And as long as those banks can provide data to Canadian officials in a timely manner, they're fine to keep that information on US servers. Now, the other aspect too is that the financial services chapter chapter 17 also opens up access to cross-border services. So obviously Ohio again had a pretty healthy financial services export to Canada, but this is going to allow or open access to things like portfolio management, investment advice, and electronic payment services, so I think we'll see some definite boost and growth in that area, which is great. I mean, Canada has 5 or 6 big banks, and not a lot of competition. So I think certainly it will be welcome to have more opportunities or options, especially in the financial services or investment area, portfolio management area. And again, as I referenced in my last slide, the national treatment for all USMCA located financial companies operating in other USMCA party locations is an important aspect, because it means that then US financial institutions cannot be treated differently than a Canadian financial institution with respect to their services. So